of Luc Tuymans. It's a little bit, I think it's the most ridiculous introduction I can give, because I'm quite sure that all of you know who Luc Tuymans is, and besides that, he will start speaking about his practice soon. So maybe to say anything, I can say something about the KASKlezing, the lecture series. Many of you know this series. More or less every week there is a lecture, and we always look for young artists, upcoming artists, and more established artists. And I think in the 8 years I'm doing this, the enthusiasm for a lecture was never so overwhelming and so big as for this lecture. And so I think that also you are one of the lucky ones that's here. To say something about the relevance and the meaning of Luc Tuymans, I think his history is more or less known, and otherwise you also see it. But started in '92, a big exhibition, a documenta of Jan Hoet he was part of. 9 years later, 2001, representing Belgium in Venice, and already from that moment, at least '92, the period 2001 until today, for sure he became one of the most important painters of our century. I think if we state the importance of his work, we immediately also think about painters like Gerard Richter, Marlene Dumas, Kiepenberger, painters who not only have a signature, but also really changed or put their stamp on the meaning of painting, on the medium of the meaning of the medium. And teaching in KASK also for 8 years. During these years, I see many students who are influenced by the paintings of Luc Tuymans. You see traces of his work. And the importance, I think it's the anecdote of Lenka, who is also here, that she was complaining that there weren't any painters in this series, and then I said, okay, then what is a painter you would like to see? And she mentioned Luc Tuymans. So thanks to Lenka, we have Luc Tuymans here. So please give a very warm welcome to Luc Tuymans.
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this okay with the mic? Yeah, I haven't given a lecture in some time. I gave a lot of lectures. We had to postpone this because of my operation in my neck, and so now it's reasonably okay. Although in that period I was looking at my work and I thought it was all shit. But anyway, so I decided to do this, so I have to do this. So what I'm going to do actually is to show, I'm not going to show any institutional shows or museum shows. It's about 150 solo shows so far. And a lot of them, of course, were gallery shows, which I actually see as very important, because this is the first point that you actually show new work. It's not just a shop. It's actually, and I actually made a selection of some of these shows. You will always see a title appearing, and then not all the works of the show. Sometimes we have installation shots, sometimes we don't. And to make a trajectory up until, let's say, a little bit the beginning, up until, let's say, the last show, which was in New York last year, which was called The Bar. So let's just, I mean, it's a lot of images, so I'll have to speed it up a little bit. So let's go to the first show. Oh. Wait. Daar kwam ik vanuit. Yeah, it works. Anyway, this was the very first show I ever did in '85. It was actually an idea together with another artist that barged out and eventually decided not to show his work. And we were able to get our hands on a mailing list of 5,000 people who were important in Belgium. And he decided to back off because there was not enough reaction. We asked people to react with a telegram, and not a lot of them did. But I actually then proceeded. It was a show for one day. I actually asked this is the Palais de Théâtre, which still exists in Ostende, which is a terminal palace in a way. In that sense, you still have the swimming pool that doesn't exist anymore. And I asked them to use the swimming pool and the surroundings to show my work. So at the day of the opening, my mother came, my father came, a couple of friends. My mother went down the pool and started to cry. It was actually a complete disaster. But at the end of the evening, towards the evening, I was standing on the balustrade where you have the lockers where you can exchange your clothes. I looked at it and I said, it's going to be okay. And eventually it was okay. It was also important because for me, coming out of a very small atelier, which was also my living space at that point, it was interesting to see the work in this space, to see it in a space which is also not a white cube, and that it would actually hold itself to its own. So I was convinced. I mean, it's an important thing to say that when you're an artist, it's like a conviction. You have to have this conviction that it will actually eventually work. So we'll go, well, the ones you see here is a lineup of 3 works that I put on these ledges. And I'll show you, there's one of a Chinese guy, which is actually Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, and then 3 images of the Rivierbel, which was a sort of building that was in the harbor in Antwerp, and then the other one, which I will take closer. Here you can see it a bit closer, and then these 2, which were the last ones, which is actually a postcard, a concession in Amoy in 1935 from the French, which is in China, which is now Xi'an, which is actually opposite of the Taiwan Straits, and a sort of lacquered oval in which you could see yourself mirrored. And underneath, I actually, together with a librarian in Antwerp, I found the Mandarin sort of constellation of characters to create amnesia. It's interesting that this work was going to go to China and it's refused because it's opposite of the Strait of Taiwan. So we continue. Then there are 3 shows which were done not in Zenowix, but in a gallery called Ruimte Morgen, which was a friend of mine and also an artist. The space doesn't exist anymore. Because I did all these, trips, to get a gallery. I also worked as a bouncer, actually also in this city, Brussels and Antwerp, and when it became too violent, then I actually decided to show my work. And so I did about 68 galleries, in Cologne, eventually also with a dog, because I saw that a lot of these gallery owners were women, and German women have something with a dog. So I lended the dog of Annemarie van Kerkhove to go to these, but okay, that didn't work out. And eventually then I proposed my friend who had this gallery that showed post-conceptual art, because not a lot of painting was shown in those days, to pay the costs to do this show. And we did 3 shows together until I did a show after those 3 shows I got the invite to do a show in the museum, in the Association of the Friends of the Museum of Contemporary Art, which was actually in the cellars of the old museum in Ghent, which was an amazing tentoonstelling, very important for me. And also with the tentoonstelling I got through Van den Bussen in the museum in Ostende, and it was like a nationwide thing. And that's where also Frank de Maagde was going to come to my studio for 3 years, eventually bought a painting, and I also then found out that money was disappearing in the other gallery. It was kind of alternative, but not anymore. So I then went to Frank de Maagde. But I'm going to show you works out of these 3 groups of shows. The first was called Josephine c'est pas une femme. It was 88, 89, A Place in the Sun, and Zimmerfrei. And these works were, of course, works that were picked out of, there were already 150 works behind me, so I made a choice of them. But since that only happened in the first show. The second show was a show that was made, especially, so all the shows that I'm going to show you were made as a show, but also as a constellation. Not that I work at different works at the same time, I only work with one work at a time, and that has to hold itself, but also I wanted to create a sort of discourse between the works and to create a sort of vacuum with every show. I also stopped painting from 80 to 85 in order to, because I was a little bit fucked up. I'll show you one painting which was out the former period, was 1978, and the one that's coming up is also from 1978, or no, 75 even. And I was at that point, I fucked up because it became too existential, too close, and too suffocating. So then I started to film for 5 years and came back to painting. So what you can see here is one of these old paintings. Most of them are overpainted because of lack of money, and also a lot of them are destroyed. There's about 4 or 5 that survived it. It's mostly were sort of covered self-portraits. I mean, they're not really based on a photograph. They're not based on a real existing person. It's sort of an imaginatory thing. Here you can see also that I overworked the painting to a certain sense that the face completely dissipated and disappeared, which eventually was quite nice, and then came back to the hands. And that's why it's called hands. It also had to do with the idea that it was very difficult to reintroduce painting in a sense, and so I thought to make paintings that looked like they were made like 30 years ago, so that they had a sort of aging process incorporated into it. Then the next one, which is this is one of the first paintings that has to do with memory. It's a painting that's based upon another oil painting. I come out of a family which is partially Dutch and partially Flemish. There's also a story behind it, because people also ask me why the interest in the Second World War. The marriage was a very unhappy one, and on the Flemish side there had been collaboration. Actually, the person I'm named to, which is my uncle, so to speak, died as a mascot at 17 years old in Stettin to a shrapnel with an SS group. And the other part, the Dutch part, was in the resistance. So during dinner this thing came up, and it became like a phobia in the sense that I circled around this theme for a long time. 2 brothers died, the one I told you about, which I'm named after, who was actually also the best friend of ours. You know, interesting, because he was the leader of the Antwerp Hitler Jugend. And then this one, Just Dam, which was the Dutch side. So both had these 2 young people that died during the war. Strangely enough, their house was burned down, and only one thing survived, so no photographs, but a portrait of this person in 3/4, which I then turned flat. I was also quite fascinated at that point by the photography of August Sander. August Sander, that was a sort of photographer that went into the idea of the dishonesty, the idea of the pose, so to speak. And also by turning this face like in a sort of hypnotizing way, and the eyes will follow you actually everywhere. So then we make a big jump, because that was then the period where there was film and not painting. And after that I came back to painting. And what I also wanted to do for the longest time is actually to make a process that you can actually paint a drawing. And this is a drawing that is eventually this big. It's now in the collection in the museum in Bern, and was a decoupage drawing for something I was going to film. On block note paper, where you see the lines of the block note I made actually straight in with pencil into the paint. And there were three elements. There was actually pencil, there was ballpoint, and fountain pen. And although this looks very spontaneous, it is not. It's completely recreated in a sense. And this was the first time I was able to enlarge that up into a painting. I made several of those. There's 10 or 20 of those. I'm not going to show them all. Then the next stage, I wanted to make it more comprised, and it also goes into this one, which is like correspondence, which has a specific story behind it, and also looks like a sort of clinical representation, and also has to do with the idea of a specific anecdote. This goes back to Van Oudshoorn, who was a Dutch writer who was stationed in Berlin from 1905 to 1910, and was not enabled to bring his wife over. So every afternoon when he had lunch, or midday when he had lunch, he went to one of these cafes, which were very ornate, very bourgeois, and actually you could buy postcards. So he would actually, with a red pencil, cross on the table on which he had eaten, and send that to his wife during a period of 5 years, which is kind of an elementary factor of homesickness. Then right after that, I then eventually came to terms. I made a big trip, went to Auschwitz, went to Dachau, Theresienstadt, and in Theresienstadt there was also a book from Alfred Cantor, who was a prisoner actually who was a détenu who was in Theresienstadt, in Auschwitz and in Schwarzheide and survived it. And in 1979 in New York, he was Czech. In the days he was there in the beginning, because this was a camp that was a representational thing, it was also used to fool people that everything was going fine, and the detainees got these postcards to send home to their family. And by the end of the war, when he survived all those camps, strangely enough, they were brought back by the Russians to the point of departure, which was the Theresienstadt. And he stole a box of these postcards and took it to New York. He actually made a whole book, which is no written word, it's all drawings, which is insane. And in the beginning of that book, he glued this postcard, which is a black and white postcard, and underneath he wrote "Our New Quarters." I used the color, which is a military color, and I actually painted the casemates and the dead tree, and also then actually put the words lit up in yellowish white, so that they look like a subtitle, in a sense, underneath the situation, as if nothing had changed in this whole time period. If you look at most of the drawings of these detainees, there is a great similarity in what they actually produce on an emotive level. Then the next one, which was then even worse, is actually the gas chamber, which was based upon my visit in Dachau. And I was in a hotel room and I took a part of a calendar, and on the back of it, with a watercolor in the space, I made this. And it was laying around in my studio for more than 8 years before this painting was made. It was also yellow by the time I made this painting, which I've all incorporated into the painting. It also gives the idea of a certain warmth, an idea of skin, and then of course the inappropriate element, because this is a very metonymous painting, because without it could only be a cellar, but even when it was used, it was also actually masked as a shower room. So in a sense, this also installed this infinite distrust into imagery, into me, even towards my own, to a certain extent. And so that the reason why is this Second World War so important, it is important because of the biographical thing I told you, but also on a larger geopolitical element. It's important till this very fucking day. I mean, Putin is still talking about fighting the Nazis. And it's also an element where you can see that the idea of European empire dissolved itself, and the only solution that we have left is, of course, the European community. So this is a nation states that actually came into being. And the other thing is the psychological breakdown, which was, of course, the Holocaust in itself, which is also turned into a very problematic situation as we speak. So this all sort of gathers up. Then another painting, Schwarzheide, which was after the visit, where there was no camp, but there was a blockhouse, where you could see drawings that were made but were incomplete. And they were made with a certain substance out of charcoal, and to give this sort of bluish, azure-like image. And they were sort of ripped up and then dispersed, I mean, under the detainees, and of course most of these drawings, when put back together, were unsubstantial and not complete. So what I took is the surroundings, which is the trees, put a canvas which was grounded into the sun so that it bleached, and then very fast actually painted this on it, and then the lines symbolized actually what it. I also turned it into a mosaic in the Palazzo Grassi, where you have like the idea that you walk over a fosse commune before you go into the show. Okay, then we go, the speed is okay, I think. Then there's this is already another show, Zimmerfrei. And this was, I just showed you this for the installation, for the size of the work. It was a point where I didn't have any, at that day, I didn't have any canvas to work on, so I cut up a cardboard box, grounded it, and started to paint on it. So the first thing I painted was the one which you can see, the little sort of urban setting, which was about the sort of, more of metaphysical point in day, like noon or whatever. The second one, still a normal image, could be a sort of enlargement. You also see the film element that crops in, of course, of an empty shop. And then I started to look for other imagery, so it becomes less innocent. The third one is actually the first sort of vegetable comprimés that the Germans used during the Second World War on the Eastern Front and were reused when they went to the moon with NASA. And the last one is actually not fully a painting, it's the cut-out face of Richard Heinrich, who was the guy who actually organized the full idea of the Entlosung and the Wannsee conference. And I actually cut it out of the magazine and sort of masked it with these sunglasses and put them in front of a bookcase. This all sort of gave the idea of time, and that's why I called it, gave it the title Die Zeit. Next painting is an element that goes sift, which is a product which you clean. I took it all away and then actually was impressed by the way that you see the movement that sort of gives an animated idea of how you could clean something, and then the bar, and also my old fascination with Russian constructivism. I mean, all those things were in that, but eventually it's a product that has to do with cleaning. Then we go to the last show, which was A Place in the Sun, I think, in that gallery. Here you see actually two images. At the point when I was painting this, this is actually an image which is a black and white image of Hitler, who is making a sort of stroll with his colleagues in the snow in Berchtesgaden. But at that point I was also interested in Japanese and Chinese woodblock prints, and with Caspar David Friedrich. So I was trying to imagine what would it be if you would reduce a Caspar David Friedrich to one color, which is yellow in this sense. So it was a combination of those two, and it happened on the spot, so to speak. Then a triptych, which was going back to my visit to Auschwitz, where you have and Buchenwald, where you have the lampshade made out of human flesh. You have a sick tooth, which is Röntgen, and then you have the vitrine where you can see how they made cloth out of human hair. I made it in a way that it looks like carbonized imagery, like very graphic in a sense, and the colors are very slight. I mean, you probably are not able to see that, but there is a greenish, orangey green situation, or a dégradé in this whole situation. Then the last one, which is called Die Wiedergutmachung, was based upon a documentary by Katrina Seibold, who made a documentary about in the time that I painted these paintings, because this is the size of the television set that I have. And it was actually a documentary in which she talks about the one-act twins, which were gypsies, not Jews, on which the Germans experimented and they were never repaid. And said, Wiedergutmachung needs repayment. And all of a sudden you have this sort of like full-blown, full size of the screen of the television, where you see dislocated eyeballs and hands, which actually belong to the they are still held in the archive in Baden-Württemberg. So this, I met with the woman also, and she thanked me because this was one of the things that actually were iconic for her documentary, which was quite controversial, because a lot of these people that actually experimented on these people were never tried or never denazified, because they actually, the process was, after the war, the Cold War was actually sort of put aside. And the strange thing is that her father was actually the person who made Jud Zeus as a German propaganda film. So this kind of an elliptical country, Germany, it never stops. Then the next is the idea of a rear view mirror in a car, a DS, where you can see what's actually behind you and it's in front of you. So then we go to the first show in the gallery, which I've been working actually 34 years, which is unfortunately closed now. And this was the very first show. And this show was a show which was about toys. I mean, or let's say the smallness of the world, or the fact that when something is small and it's a toy, you can manage it, you can actually be omnipotent in how you actually work with it. And there was another fascination about which I will talk. I will first show you an image how I looked like then, so that is years ago. So that was the very, very, very beginning. So I also got the first article then in the Morgen in a newspaper, went to a bar where artists were. There was another artist that, when I was ordering a drink, that tapped me on the shoulder. I turned myself around and he smacked me on the head. So, the show, the first elements in the show were these toys. And these were actually based upon following catalogs of, with the modeling train and the modeling world, where you had these small figurines that actually still exist that you can put in a diorama. And I took out the ones that sort of fitted and gave a sense of reality, but you could feel that it was not real, that it was put in scene, and that they were also plastic, that they were not like real people in a sense. I was also interested and fascinated by Edward Hopper for the longest period of time. And I actually liked Hopper, not because Hopper was art, but for me Hopper was a toy in a sense, and this was my reaction to it, in very small paintings. So this one is called The Cry, this one is called The Swimming Pool, and this one is called Suspended in itself. You see the family, which is not in accordance with the heights of the windows and all that. And the last one is called The Murderer. Then, in opposition of that, there were more paintings. There is one that followed up, which is a painting that is based upon a real image, but then distorted, which was actually the image of Albert Speer, his official image. And I changed the face, I called it Secrets, and I changed the face into a mannequin doll-like figure, where only actually the sort of on the side you see the lapels that indicate the idea of the uniform, and the coloring also gives you a sort of indication that it has to do with fashion. Then probably one of the more known paintings was The Body, which was a doll that I had in my studio that I played with as a kid, that you could open up with a zipper and stuff so that it would come alive. Here it works as a sort of like, it looks like an injury in a sense. It looks like a scar or a scarification. I also used a special medium underneath the paint so it would actually create a craquelé, which is very premature. And I still remember when this painting was eventually entered the collection of the Smack, that the conservator would say to Jan Hoot, yeah, now you have a body, and maybe not during your lifetime, but after that it will be nobody. Then there was another show, because it was also important to always put the audience onto the wrong foot, because at that point people were thinking, there's the gray zone and there's this sort of poetry going on, but then I always tried to make it one step ahead, and then they were kind of like uneased with what was actually shown, which was already the case with the show Suspended, and with this one it went even further. This was called The Diagnostical Blade. When I did my show in the Gonzalo in Berry in 1992, I wanted to make portraits again, but I didn't know how. And I didn't want to make any psychological portraits. I wanted to make something different. And I found these books, these medical books that medical students use, and I met a psychiatrist at the opening and I asked him if they still did that. So he sent me a book from Switzerland, which was called Der Diagnostische Blick, with all these images. And I just cropped these images. Most of the time I changed the eyes also. I see we can, so that they don't look into the spectator. I also applied the paint horizontal so that that they flattened themselves out, so that there was no way to empathize with what you were actually looking at, so it just blew back at you. And except for one, I actually changed the eyes, so they went over you, they never looked at you in a sense. You were not able to sort of create any sort of real conversation or negotiation with what you were looking at. So that's the first one. The second one, the third one, this one, which is now hanging in Plotsaland in the museum in Antwerp, opposite of the Madonna, together with, because it's owned by my former gallerist, and we had this idea of donating it. We still have to think about it, because I didn't know what they were going to do with the museum and turn it into what they did now, but anyways, well. So here, this is the portrait of a woman. That's why it's also hanging. There's no explanation in the museum, which is stupid, because this is a woman who had breast cancer, and it's also a woman, and therefore there was the link with this Madonna. So, and it's really an image that goes overhead. I mean, with the eyes. Then the other one is the only one that looks back, which is the one with and then it goes on. This is a breast. legs, and so on and so on. Then we go to the next one, Superstition, the very first show in New York in 1994. So I've been working with David for 30 years, so I think when I started working with David there was one assistant, now there's about 600 people working, so it's kind of changed into a corporate constellation. This was still in Soho, and I think we have some installation shots of this. Frank actually never took that many installation shots. So here you can see some idea of the size of the paintings. You can see that some of them are very small. It was also interesting because when I showed this in New York there, I remember when I was there before leaving and then a couple from LA came in, and since the size was so modest, these people who were potential collectors said, is this some kind of folk art? So the very first image you see was about the idea of a poltergeist. It's an element of an insect in front of the genitalians of a body that is sort of like linearly sort of designated behind the image. It was also an image of fear. Then the second one is, there's now a carpet of this that I made for a show in the Académie der Künste, which is 10 by 10. And this painting was made in 94, they said. And it's actually the sort of the seat on which somebody was murdered. On the other hand, it was interesting, it's a flower motif, but when it's cut, it looks like the sort of cut through a brain. Then this is the kitchen of a serial killer called Peter, who actually started out killing animals, then drinking the blood of animals, then killing people, mixing the blood with the animal's blood and the human blood, and drinking that. And that was his kitchen. So everything that looks, in a sense, convivial and looks banal, in a sense, could turn around into something completely different. I also was kind of interested by pornography, and I started to look at the backdrop of pornography, and I saw these pillars, and I multiplied them, because pillars are things on which something falls, it will take its form. And also extrapolating the light and the form going behind the boundary, so enlarging the imagery. Then we go to another show, Heimat, which was in 1995. And this was made out of disgust for my city. At that point, I don't know if it was the Vlaams Blok or already the Vlaams Belang. 1 out of 3 people in Antwerp voted for this xenophobe party, which is now again at hand as we speak. So, and I said I want to make something that at that point they had the winter and Veraleman, so they were evolving to a point that they wanted to get away from their symbols. So I said, let's go back to the incontingency and the stupidity and go back to this imagery, because nobody did that. So the first image was the Flemish flag. I painted this Flemish flag as a watercolor, fairly small, and crumbled it together, and with the punaise put it on the wall of my studio, and then took a Polaroid of it. This was the first time I also used Polaroids. And I was amazed because the Polaroid was such a bad quality that it sort of like dissipated the image. The image was sort of at the point of fleeting and going away. And that was also the idea. Then I used this image, which is an image which is based on Ernest Klaas, who was one of the writers who actually, together with Felix Timmermans, literally collaborated with the Germans during the Second World War. Unlike Van Ostay and Elschot, that were misused by the movement, because it's also interesting, of course, to note that the Flemish movement in the beginning, and we'll come to that later, was a completely different situation. But here you see him as a sort of idea of nationalism where it is masked, so it's like a snowed under image where you don't see the facial traits, you just see these sort of indications of something, and this is called the Flemish intellectual. When it was first shown in Berlin, everybody thought it was Sigmund Freud. Then I made a whole series of drawings, and before coming to this image, which is the Iron Tower, which has actually been blown up after the war and rebuilt, but was actually a pacifistic monument, because of course one should not forget that most of the militia were also Flemish farmer sons who didn't understand the command of their superiors, which were in French, and then wrongfully went into the wrong side instead of right, went to the left, straight into the German machine fire. And actually, this was a pacifist monument that during the 2 world wars became a symbol of the new order, and that was, of course, abused. One also forgets that the Flemish movement in the beginning was a social movement. So all that controversy is then packed together and condensated in this sort of shimmer or chimera of this tower together with the lines that go into the uniform. Then to make everybody completely pure, because I, at that point, was also criticized, especially by the right wing, for making art for the few. I said I will make art for the many, which is this sort of village, Lissabeke, where you can see also the cracks in the painting and all that. The reaction to the show, then we have one more, which is the idea of fingers, which gives a sort of very, very sticky feeling. The idea of the show was imminent. I mean, I got death threats. They were going to blow up something in the gallery, which all didn't happen. Eventually, most of these paintings were bought immediately by the Flemish government and then were stacked away in embassies. Eventually, they came back into, now I think most of them are in the museum. Alongside that show, nearly the same year, or a year later, there was a show in the States, which I called The Heritage. So that was a show about patriotism, because nationalism, well, maybe now, but in that point, nationalism didn't exist in the States, but patriotism do exist in the States. So that was called The Heritage. All the paintings were called and had the same title. So here you see some installation shots, and here you see the first painting. The first painting was this idea of a sort of identity that is actually borrowed from what you wear, what you actually indicate by signalizing, and that's of course the baseball cap. Once it as a cloth and more dangerously when it becomes leather. Then we have the American flag as a neon sign. And then this is a worker in a chemical plant. This one is the old, I mean, the jolly old granddad, the American guy, although actually this was, one of the guys was in the conspiracy of the murder of Kennedy and was the head of the Ku Klux Klan. So then you have the Mount Rushmore, because for me it's kind of a stupidity that you put your face onto a rock, but that's what happened with the 4 American presidents. And the last one is a painting that was stolen during the show. And this is actually the Mormons, the altar where they actually get married. The woman phoned me crying, the collector, and said, "Can you make it again?" I said, "I don't think so." Then the next one is called Security, which is about the idea of gender in a certain way, and plants. So the first image is a plant that was, actually a lot of plants were changing in that period from male to feminine in order to survive. This is the idea of that idea also, of course, is a very eroticized thing because it is an orchid. And I actually covered the image with a green foliage, so it became sort of toxic in a way. Then you have something that was made after maquette of a drum set. I always want to make work that doesn't make you think of music or sound. I think my work has to be soundproof. I also never bought a record in my life. So if I work, it has to be in silence, and the work also has to emanate that silence as a different element of sound. Then you have a big smoker, so this is actually the inside of lungs from a medical handbook, and you can put on 3D glasses and then you can see it in 3D. Then a hut, which is just a habitat made out of a cardboard box and a mouth. My father, who used to be somebody who made fake dentures, really liked this work. Then we go to a show which was also quite controversial, which was called Manikitoko, or Beautiful White Man, which is not the right translation of it, but it was made on purpose. This was first shown in New York, and later it was shown in the Belgian Pavilion in 2001, where it was kind of shocking, because nobody wanted the Queen didn't want to come to it, for that matter. And it also created a specific momentum, because at that point Luther the Witch wrote this book about Lumumba and the murder, and actually completely denounced the idea that it was the CIA. No, it was the Brussels establishment that really, hour by hour, planned the murder of Lumumba, and the whole situation that the king, of course, was aware. Also at that point, that same year, there was a film from Raoul Peck that came out about the same theme, and 2 years after the fact, we were all invited in London in the Center of Cultural Studies to talk about momentum, because by then there was the Lumumba Commission in Belgium, where actually Louis Michel personally excused himself for the Belgian government, to the Congolese Democratic Republic, and in particular to the family for the murder of Mohammed, not the king. So anyway, I'm going to show you two installation shots, which is one in the gallery in New York, and one, oh no, wait. And the one next to it is in the Belgian pavilion. The Belgian pavilion was interesting because I could have done something different. I could have done like a sort of mix of what I've been doing already 20 years, but I made this the center core or core part of the show because I found out that this pavilion was built by a colonial architect, so there was no better place to show it. Also the fact that it became immediately politicized because all these pavilions, I mean, which were given as a gift to the Italian king in the beginning, they were all national pavilions, so it was interesting to do that on exactly that spot. And that's why. So here you have the first image which was born out of, I mean, I never visited the Congo, but I saw the film, which was called Mwana Kitoko, and Mwana Kitoko with a B, because that means beautiful white ruler. Mwana Kitoko means beautiful white boy. So this is an image that comes out of the film of André Couvin, which was like a sort of propaganda movie made in Technicolor when the king went to Belgium, went to Congo, which was insane because at that point the kings went to the Congo to the Union Monière, but never to the people. Also the fact that he was unmarried at that point, which didn't make him a chief in any way for the African chiefs. But it was an emotional point. So you see him coming here from out of the plane on the tarmac in Leopoldville, holding the dagger. They told him to really stay upright. He wore sunglasses. He had to keep hold of the dagger. The second time he went, they virtually emasculated him by taking his dagger away. And then, of course, he was very young. He was the same age as Lumumba at that point. It was also a traumatized king because of the king's question after the war, because his father was a stupid, despotic king that stayed in Belgium, even talked to Adolf Hitler, of course, had to collaborate and then came back and then pushed his son when he was 18 years old to take over the country. So all that was going on in the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. So also the fascination with the color, so that's how it was born, and then it evolved to something completely different. Another image was like, this was an image was called Sculpture, because it was in a bar in Antwerp, and I was going to the movies with my wife, and I turned around because I felt something like a gaze in my back, and I saw a full-scale sculpture of a pygmy looking at me in a bar in Antwerp, and I took a Polaroid of it and then painted it. Because it also goes about the fascination who is eroticizing the view of the exotic view of looking back of one another. This was also a painting that then a bit later was actually auctioned off and had $1 million, all of a sudden was more than $1 million, so that was big news in Belgium. So once that broke out, it was on all the front pages, and the press was in front of me to ask me where the millions were. The million was, of course, they didn't understand that it's the auction house that owns that. And of course, they went to the bar, where the bar owner put the whole thing in the middle. So this is also an idea about looking back at what is actually the opposite. So then, this is sort of reenactment of a documentary that was made in Cuba, because they still had the cars from the 50s, for so-called, actually sort of emulating the place where Lumumba and his cabinet was actually killed. Although the real spot on which this happened has never been found back, in a sense. And then, of course, we have the antagonist and the protagonist, and you have Lumumba himself, which is based out of different archive material, looking at him as a sort of like, yeah, sort of an element of acculturation also. I should not forget that he was also the head of the Evalués, and it was also interesting that he was actually educated in the same mission post as the guy that fucked him over, which was Mobutu. And you see him here with glasses and a sort of necktie that is not completed or is actually not painted in a sense to sort of emulate that element. Then the last one goes back to a more gruesome fact. This was actually in the year that I was painting it, actually the guy who was the colonial policeman who killed Lumumba and dissolved the bodies of his cabinet and himself into a bath of acid. Before doing that, he had the hunch that this would be somewhat I mean, that there was something like a calamity and there was something really important, and he actually tore out 2 teeth of Lumumba out of his skull. I changed that through chalk because of the sort of failure of the acculturation process, and I gloved the hands of my wife into black gloves, and that's why you see those 2 things. The colonial officer, before dying that year, threw those 2 teeth into the North Sea. Then we go to the Documenta, of which I'm only going to show 1 painting because it was in itself problematic. So this was the Documenta, the second one I was in, the one of Oakley and Weser, which was mostly about the idea of colonialism and post-colonialism. But right before that, my wife and I were in New York, where actually 9/11 happened. And it was so gruesome that you could not react to it. So I actually came to the idea, what should we do? And I came to the plan to make something that was idyllic. And then all of a sudden I remembered a sort of small study of Cézanne, which was a not finished sort of still life where you could see the white, which was lead white, so it turned blue in aging, and took that as a proposition, but then enlarged the still life, which is the last denominator, the least important one, actually in painting, to a gigantic size, so it's no longer to be consumed. Also threw back the idea of the contrast, so it looks like a projected image. It was a sort of very political painting because it was apolitical in a sense, and nobody got it. I mean, not the people from the Documenta. It's only years later when it was reshown at the Tate Modern that it sort of simmered through what the real importance was. It was also the idea to show that something that is big is maybe not so meaningful. But that was the answer to the whole 9/11, which we come back to because I reacted to it a couple of years later. Then we are there, the show proper, which actually implies the idea of improper. And so here you see an installation shot, another one, and then we go to the first painting. By then, the United States under George W. Bush, which is like nearly Down syndrome, like changed to something like completely intolerant. You couldn't make any joke anymore, not even in New York. And everybody was paranoid, terrorism, the whole bullshit going on. And I think, this gave us, and there was also a surge of ballroom dancing, which was kind of interesting, the idea of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So I was actually roaming on the web, my wife and I found this image of the Governor's Ball in 2005, where they dance on the skull. And you see this sort of swirling couple in the smoking and all that. And the second one is an image that was, of course, translated immediately as 9/11, but it's actually the demolition of a building in Chicago in 1995. But you see the billowing, the smoke that comes out of it. And then there was this painting, because after having made the painting of the ballroom dancing, I was reading an article in the newspaper, and my friend, who was then my friend and then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Karel de Gucht, made a very sexist remark about Condoleezza Rice, that he said she is very smart and not unpretty. So that's why he came to the aberration within actually the whole operation of George W. Bush, going for somebody we didn't know of. I mean, we didn't, and we don't still know what she thinks till this very day. But also this sort of determined face, also accepting the idea of racism in order to get to a certain elemental point. At that point, she was the most powerful woman on the globe. She was once asked if she saw this image by one of my collectors, and without turning her head, she said, yes. Then we go to make another leap, because we're already in 2006, I think now. And this was a show which was born out of a fascination with, I never thought that religion would be yet again something that we should worry about or think about. And I also was thinking about what the idea of the utopic would be. And then I started to think about the educational system in my own country, where actually most of the people that are somebody were actually only formed by one form of schooling, which is the Jesuits. I mean, if you think of Jan Hoot, Tom Barman, you name it. I never went there because I didn't come from the right social layer, but I could recognize them. So then what I first did was to do a show in Japan, where eventually the guy who interviewed me was also from a Jesuit college. And because there was Jesuits, and they were burned actually in Japan. And there I showed actually 3 or 4 paintings. The first one is actually a church, which is actually a trompe-l'oeil, because the back wall is actually completely painted, it's not there. So, which was interesting, you know. Also the idea, of course, that then you see what the Baroque actually is. The Baroque is a way of overwhelming people, and it's a huge element of propaganda in a sense. And it's quite constructed, it's quite vertical in a sense. And so that was great to do that. Then the next one is the head of Loyola itself, which is stripped and turned into a full head, because this is the dead mask of him, and then put together and is kept in the Vatican. And then, of course, the idea of the double sun, the idea of light and spirituality that comes in. The next show was called Les Revenants, which is more about the Jesuits in a different way, and the educational system. Of course, this is the typical schoolboy, but it's actually also an image that I kept from a sort of horror movie, a science fiction movie, and which is called The Valley, in which actually a whole bunch of kids were born with blue eyes and then eventually are alienated to aliens and fuck up the village. So here you see this element of, in the picture the kid is more wide-eyed, here is more damaged goods. Then, wait, last one. This is the book. This is actually the main Jesuit church in Rome, but in a book that you open up in a sense. You see the line over there. Then that's Rome. This is the Basilic, St. Peter's Basilic, which is from behind. And this is actually when Cardinal Danneels was installed as cardinal. And you see all the prelates over there, but you also see this huge construction. It's always interesting to see that if you look at Gothic buildings, they can still move because they're based upon wood. This construction is an absolute construction. There is no way, two ways about it. And then in the same year, we have the Pope Ratzinger and Goldenbach, which was the Jesuit who, actually general Jesuits who abdicated, and there was this row about South America, and here there's a sort of fake reconciliation between the two of them. Then we go to another form of the utopic, and this was called Forever, the Management of Magic, which was a show about my fascination with what's his name? With Walt Disney in a sense. And I still remember that they were very afraid because the office in Dave Cerner got a message before the show opened that they were closely watching the show if I would abuse the things like Mickey Mouse and whatever, which I didn't do, because actually what I was aiming at, and here you can see some installation shots. This was also the first time I went into the American format, you know, that the oversized thing, they all hate it, by the way. So the very first one is actually the day of the opening of Disneyland. I was amazed by it, and I wanted to make a show about how you can make and control an environment. This is the idea of the magic, where you actually put imagination and incarcerate it into a theme park. And here, this is the image that was taken off the website of Disney, because this was the first day where you could take the ride into this grotto of Alice in Wonderland, which in that sense got a gas leak the same day it opened. The next image is an image that luckily was not realized, is the maquette of Epcot, which was the sort of perfect city that Walt was going to build. And underneath you have a tunneling system that the goods will pop up, and in the middle you have a hotel, and then everything was organized in houses around that. He actually didn't want to make the same mistakes twice, so he flew over the entirety of the United States to find a spot that was not sort of, could not be diluted by anything around it and would be pure. Then the last, wait, sorry, what do I do now? Yeah, okay. Then this one is a turtle. It looks like two people kissing each other, but it's not. It was a turtle made out of light bulbs that also collapsed the day of the opening. A little bit the same size as the same size as the Alice in Wonderland. So they were fairly large paintings. And then this is an animatron, of which actually Walt Disney made a lot. We will see one in the end in the last show too again. That rings a bell, and it's sort of like working with this sort of animated element, but then in real life, like in 3D. Then we go from there to a show which was the third part in the sort of trilogy, which was the idea of imagery that was made on a digital way, or put into a post. A show called Against the Day, which was in Wales. Because Dirk Snauwaert wanted me to do a show, but he didn't have any money to lend work, so I said, okay, I'll make you an entire show. So I made an entire show with 22 paintings for this space. We also opened up all the windows for the first time, so the light could come in. It was great because it's a very concrete building, so very harsh in that sense. I'm just going to show you a couple of images of that. And here you see the first image was called Against the Day. This is actually a friend of mine, a colleague, also a painter, who I installed in my garden, like shoveling away during the night. And there he loses actually the shovel and the hand. These paintings were shown, before they were shown in this show, they were first shown, one was shown in the Stedel in Frankfurt, and the other one was shown in China. Then they came back together because they're actually diptych. The funny thing was when I won the Max Beckmann Stiftung Professor Prize in the Stedel, I had to give lectures, but I also had to put some of my works in the museum, in the collection. And I put this one work, the first one where you see him shoveling, in the space of the 19th century with works of Max Liebermann, and also the work of Fernand Knopf that was there that I remembered. And it was a shock, because although the imagery could be easily fitting in to that framework, it didn't, because the light was digital. So that sort of like gives you the idea how, even if you want to get away from your contemporarity, it's impossible to do that. So this is the Against the Day. Then here you have a sort of, this is not a real office, it's a virtual office which was made. Then you have like, out of a website called The Normals, you see mapped out faces before they are constructed to a real face. And then you have a digital sundown, which looks like a nuclear explosion. Then we go to a show called The Summer is Over, which came about because a friend of mine with his father was sitting in the same restaurant as me. And by that time the father was already dementing, and during the dinner the father turns to me and says, "The summer is really over." So that's where it comes from. And I also wanted to make a show about sort of detangling the mythology of the artist and just working with ideas that were close to me, like a window that was actually, which we can see first an installation shot here, which was in one space then, the third space at David Swerner's. And like the window that was opposite the door of where I lived, which had a crack, then enlarged that. And then also my self-portrait, one of the very few, which my wife took, which is not really a nice one, it's just a sort of casual one, which is a matter-of-fact like one. And also the window of the zoo that I pass on my way through my studio. We're doing okay. So. Then another show which is called The Shore, which was in London. This was during the elections in Scotland, and the Scottish try and get away because of Brexit, and they wanted to stay in the European community. The three portraits here that you see are actually based, and I'm going to show them much closer. I'm going to show first some installation shots. So this is wall painting I saw in a hotel in Balmoral in Edinburgh. And this is two other paintings of which I will talk briefly. And these are the three portraits. These portraits are actually very, very, very big close-ups of Sir Henry Raeburn's paintings. I did a show at the Wallace Collection, which is the exhibition space of the University in Edinburgh, where I interchanged the size of these portraits with images of canaries. But I was so intrigued, and always was intrigued by Sir Henry Raeburn, also because I know the portrait that I saw as a kid, which is in Ghent now, of Sir Edgar Allen, who was a slave trader, who was painted by Raeburn. And Raeburn was somebody who didn't draw a lot, but painted very efficiently, very fast, and very accurately. So what I did when I was there in Edinburgh, I took with my iPhone actually pictures of it and then closed in to the imagery. and repainted that again. Eventually, these are three people that were really important for the Scottish Enlightenment, which is really important because a lot of people forget that 6 Scotsmen wrote the American Constitution. The idea of the pursuit of your own happiness is a Scottish idea. Also the fact that the Scottish were not illiterate, although, so there is this huge sort of elementary sort of intellectual property that goes with it. So yeah, you have William Robertson, John Robinson, and John Playfair. Then the next one is a large painting, which is now, I donated to the Tate Modern, which, this was still the period where terrorism was there, ISIS was there, and this is actually the beginning of a film called The Twist of Sand, in which the crew of a submarine comes out to surrender and then it gets shot. This is the moment before it gets shot. But I was kind of really intrigued by the darkness of the image itself and the reducing of the figures. I also later on used it in an animation. And then the other idea of the show was the idea of cannibalism. This is Hasegawa, of which I made 3 or 4 paintings, but this was a painting when he was masked as a kid by his brother. And it has a sort of Goya-like element. So Mr. Hasegawa actually was famous because in the end of the 70s, he was studying at the Sorbonne and lured a Dutch student to his apartment, killed her and tried to eat her. He was then repatriated by the Japanese. He was from a good family, was never tried, and actually died a year ago. And became like a cult figure talking about this idea of cannibalism. This is my lamp in my bedroom when I wake up. Then Le Mépris, show in New York again in 2016, where I actually, this was before the elections of Trump, and I made a combination between a childhood memory and something else. So here you see some installation shots, and here you see the 3 first works of the show. This is called, it's like murky water. This is like water on which you can see the shadows, but is also a can of Fanta, and this is this idea of deterioration, and you see also the shadow of a car. Then the other element that was important was the sort of like floating flower parade that I remember from my childhood. I used to walk underneath these cars to push them. And I was also always amazed by this idea because they had a sort of frightening element, although very sort of joyful in their appearance. This also then sort of has this sort of propaganda-like element, or that has to do with elections. And then the work that goes back, it's called Le Mépris, it goes back to the fireplace of Malaparte, the Villa Malaparte, which is in Capri, on which there was a beautiful movie with the same title of Godard, where you can see actually Brigitte Bardot understands zilch of what is going on, and it's a perfect idea of something that cannot be recreated clearly epically. Then the last show at my gallery in Antwerp, sadly, which is called The Seconds. This was there was an animation film which I'm not showing here, which is 80, it consists of 80 paintings. It's like a little animal that friends of mine actually rented a sort of place with a swimming pool during COVID. And at the end of the night, there was this sort of floating seahorse on which the owner started to produce a laser show. And I made a sort of, in the back of the last page of the show, I made an animation film, and it ended with Happy Birthday, because the rest of the show was rather gloomy. So I was actually asked to by Art Forum during the pandemic to make a drawing of the virus, which I thought was rather stupid. So eventually I thought this thing is like a global thing, so we have to find imagery that is on the one hand abstract and not abstract. And I came up with the idea of numbers. Now this one that you see is an installation shot, this one too. The first one you saw was an emptied out theater, and here you see the core of the show, which were actually numbers. Uneven numbers that you could not actually sort of divide. This 1, 7, 3, 9. And they were like really large. So the numbers had the size of a sort of nearly full-grown kid. And you don't see it on this, but the inner work is sort of painting. It's also not black, it's a construction of indigo and several things, so it gives this sort of space around it. And it was also interesting because it gives you the idea which we were all busy with, which were numbers in terms of retracting or adding. So this idea. In the other one, the next one, you see another stage. And that was actually the whole show. A lot of people hated it, and other people liked it. It was really interesting because by being in this, confronted with these numbers, like physically they became nearly sculptural. So and people were hilariously enthusiastic about it. One Dutch guy wrote, I don't know why I actually came to see this book. So, and then the other one is what I saw through my window where I live, which is just the cloudy sky. Then we did pretty well. So. Then we go to Eternity, which was a show in Paris, of which I'm going to just show a couple of installation shots, and especially this particular painting, which is actually a maquette of Heisenberg, which is about this size, which was made in 1937 when they were trying to figure out how to create the H-bomb. This thing fell, so it's sort of damaged on the top, but I was amazed by the fact that this is the first this is a sort of visualization of the first explosion before it turns into a mushroom. And I painted it very large, so that you could see also that the red is very intensifying, so you see it actually on the floor. And people sort of liked it. It also has to do with my fascination with Rothko, that you are sort of like, you're just encompassed by the idea of color, in a sense. Then, yeah, you have two other installation shots. Those are the beaches. There's also a self-portrait of me, which unfortunately I don't think we have a closer look of me floating in the sea. My wife took, and then I just enlarged it and saw a very great picture of myself as an elderly white man, floating in the sea, which is kind of also a sort of critique. Here you see also people from above. This is a sort of, yeah, again, resonating in terms of the COVID situation and distancing. This was something for the French, which is of course going to Berlin, but then actually on a sort of like a faience plate, and that's the studio of the BBC. Then we go to the last show, which is called The Bar, which was in New York, where a lot of things actually came together. So this is and again, I'm sorry I can't put it closer. This is the face of the other animatron, which is actually Lincoln. This was the first real animatron, like really physically, that Walt Disney made, that gives the speech. And I actually went totally close into it until it becomes like something that is, where the face becomes something like a sort of skeleton, an idea of, yeah, you just like a sort of depraved image, where you don't see these things, and the eyes become holes and all that. Of course, we're talking about democracy at that point. Then next to it, which you can barely see here, I think, is actually the painting of a balloon with the smiley on it, which I saw during the whole time during the pandemic, floating in front of the window, maybe here too. So that's one of the paintings we never sold in the States. And then the one you see over there is actually a covered bridge, which I call the barn. But what you can see is that it's actually an image which is nearly between camp and the idea of the fairy tale, and then not, or painting by numbers, but underneath you see all the little images on my iPhone. So this is the idea of social media and how it distorts our existence. And then you have the large image on the other side, which was a sort of computer-generated deformed image of a Ukrainian soldier, which actually makes it into a monster and into a sort of totem-like imagery. There was also the bellboy, which turned into a soldier when painted, and this was in the Louvre, where you don't see the frame, but just the light on the frame. There's another image where you can see three other images, the soldier or the bellboy, but it resonates as a soldier. You see the phone in Vilnius. I did a show in Vilnius, and I went to one, and in Vilnius actually the Lithuanians killed a lot of Jews during the war, about which they never talk, but they have a museum of the KGB, because the KGB stayed there until 1991. And they have two phones, a black phone and a beige phone, on which there are no numbers because it's a straight line to Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB in Moscow. Next to it, one of the more unpopular flags, of course, because this is the flag of occupied Russian territory, which was interesting because you saw all these flags at that point and they looked like they were made out of material that was made out of plastic or something like that. Very strange. Then you have the painting of Bucha, which is actually an image that was taken straight from my from my iPad, where you see a chart and you see the lights and where they are discovering. I mean, actually trying to, picking out the bodies of that sort of massacre. And then one for the United States, which is a painting of Bob Ross, The Joy of Painting, which was, because it was about the States and Europe, so you have to make a distinction. And Bob Ross, because I was always fascinated with his sort of hairdo, and being white, this was the closest I could come to an Afro hairdo. And also the fact that it's sort of like, it's interesting because it's also an idea about branding. So, and seeing the fact that art world has changed, as I said, into a corporate situation, this was some kind of a critique to that. Also the fact that he had this huge sexual sort of voice that he made, that made a lot of housewives shiver, and a lot of people actually were saved committing suicide because they started to paint. And so here you see it's also a little bit of a joke on Velázquez because you see the painter working and so on and so on. And then the last space was the one that was the most important one actually, about nobody wrote about it. I'm going to put it a bit closer. This was actually also made right after the numbers. Because I always thought that when a pandemic happens, it's like a sort of huge, the aftermath of it is always disastrous. So I thought something is going to happen. And the first thing was to make something about, paintings about us and them, the idea of polarization, which we are now completely fucked up. I also made a painting that I don't show here, and I also didn't show in the show, and I deliberately also don't show it as a representation, which was the head and the simulation of Putin, because I knew it was going to be war in 2021, a year before it happened. This, what you see here, is based upon the research that actually was done in Harvard, where a couple of people actually made a sort of transition, and they also made graphs of how they voted through the years in the House of Representatives. And I took out 4 years. I also phoned with the guy who made the graphs so I could use them, and I put them vertical, so they have a sort of body-like. Normally they're actually horizontal. And so you have, it starts in 1951, I think, with Truman, and it ends with, actually, with Obama. Where you see gray, it is still less polarization. So you see it evolving, and with Obama, it was completely fucked. So also to instigate the idea that what and where we are at now. Okay.